The liquid culture.
What's up, everybody? Thank you for being here with me on another episode of the Liquid Culture. Today's topic is Chardonnay, probably one of the most popular white wines in the world. I wanted to do a quick video to talk a little bit about Chardonnay, but as I've been trying to do lately, we'll keep the video kind of short. Just mostly talk about the wines. If you want to know more, really kind of geek out on Chardonnay, and if it's a grape that you love or a grape that you're wanting to know more about, you can obviously find more information on the write-up on my website. Got a lot of good stuff on there. So Chardonnay, again, most everybody's heard of Chardonnay. Even if you're not a wine drinker, chances are you know that the word Chardonnay relates to a wine, and probably a white wine. It is currently like the fourth or fifth most widely planted grape in the world. Got some conflicting information on whether it is fourth or fifth, but for sure Cabernet, Merlot, Tempranillo are above it. But easily in the running for top white wine grape planted in the world. But the funny thing about Chardonnay is that it actually is a neutral grape. It's considered a neutral grape, which is probably kind of conflicting for those of you who do drink Chardonnay, because you're probably used to Chardonnay being something that you know is like a big, bold, flavorful, full-bodied, buttery white wine. But in fact, it is, before it gets really kind of touched, it is a neutral grape, which all of those kind of flavors and what the final product comes out to be is really dependent upon what is done, really kind of where it's planted, and two, what the winemaker decides to do with it once the grapes have been harvested. So places that you find Chardonnay growing the most are going to be in France, places like Champagne. It's one of the allowable grapes in Champagne production, and Burgundy, and then it's kind of smattered around the rest of France. It's being used in some other places, but the two places in France it's known best for are in Burgundy and Champagne. In the United States, predominantly you're going to see it in California, kind of all throughout California. You can find it in places like Chile, in New Zealand, in Australia. Many places are growing Chardonnay because it is a grape that is really kind of a blank canvas. So everybody's kind of trying to plant it and see what they can do with it. So again, depending upon where the grape is grown will give you different expressions of Chardonnay, vastly different expressions of Chardonnay. If you look to, I would say, if we're going to talk about kind of scale, kind of going lightest to biggest, I would say Chablis is probably where you're going to find the real light, crisp, mineral-driven, acidic Chardonnay expressions. It's a cooler climate. The soils are more of that kind of flinty, limestoney kind of soil, and then if you want to go to the farther end of the spectrum, Napa, California, big, warmer climate, much fuller bodied expressions of Chardonnay, and a lot of oaked expressions of Chardonnay. And we'll get into that a little bit. There's a lot more of it on the site, but we'll get into a little bit about oaked versus unoaked, because a lot of times that's where this polarization comes in with Chardonnay. So I say that about the United States being where you're going to find the biggest, richest, butteriest expressions of Chardonnay, but the New World's kind of funny. The New World, and over in Chablis and in Burgundy, you kind of have these set ways in which the wines have been made, and you kind of know what you're going to get if you say you go out for a Merceau or a Chablis or a Montrachet. You kind of know what the profile of that wine is probably going to taste like. In the New World, it's a little bit more difficult because everybody's trying to do something a little bit different. In Napa, back in kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, the way that everybody was wanting to drink their wine were these big, bold, flavorful expressions, and that was kind of like the sign of quality back then. A lot of people got a little burnt out on that. So now what you're seeing even in Napa are some of these producers who are trying to tone that back a little bit and make a little bit more natural expression expression, a little bit more unadulterated expression of Chardonnay, but you'll still have your Rombauers and your Beringers and Robert Mondavis and people like that who are still making those big oaked, buttery, creamy versions. But the New World's difficult. You kind of need to ask your wine clerk, at your local wine store, is this oaked or unoaked? What's the alcohol on this Chardonnay? What's the kind of the process that went into making this Chardonnay before you're really going to understand what kind of bottle of Chardonnay you're buying from a New World producer. So let's talk a little bit about the guys that I've brought here today. So it was a little difficult for me to figure out the wines that I wanted to do on this episode. If you've seen my Chenin Blanc episode, you know that that was a grape that I decided to go full out on. I went with 5 bottles of Chenin Blanc, different areas, to really kind of show how Chenin Blanc can be different. I could have very easily done that with Chardonnay because I wouldn't say it's as much of a chameleon as Chenin Blanc, but Chardonnay is very much a grape that you can find a lot of different expressions of. But I didn't want to go that route. That's kind of a long, drawn-out deal. I also didn't really want to go the route of a Burgundy versus a New World because, like I said, a lot of people in the New World are making their wines in a different style than what you would expect from the New World, including people like Raj Parr, who is actually making some a pretty incredible kind of Burgundy imitator there in Santa Barbara with the Chardonnay that he's making. Pretty incredible stuff. I would check that out. So what I ultimately ended up deciding to do was to go with a couple bottles of Chardonnay from a very well-known Chardonnay producer in California and one of my personal favorite wine producers, Mayacamas. So if you've watched, I've talked about Mayacamas before. I talked about it. I've put it in my guide to Napa Valley. I put it in the video I did with my wife Catherine about big-time Napa Valley producers, talked about their Cabernet, but I wanted to choose their Chardonnay because Mayacamas is a place that is in the New World. It is in Napa Valley, which is kind of known as this place that produces these big, buttery, oaky, creamy Chardonnays, but Mayacamas does a very kind of minimalist intervention style of winemaking in that they want their wines to express themselves to the truest nature that the grapes can allow in that area, in that kind of viticultural area, and from vintage to vintage. So Mayacamas does very minimal new oak. So they do not age their Chardonnay in these brand new, fresh oak barrels, for an extended period of time, which is where that real buttery, creamy, oxidative kind of quality comes from with a lot of those big Chardonnays. They use these big neutral oak foeders that impart very little flavor to the wine. They just allow them to go through this kind of barrel aging process, but retain their fresh liveliness because some of those foeders are 100 years old. So they're not imparting a lot of flavor to the wine. And then they also do not allow their Chardonnay to go through malolactic fermentation. So that's another place where, not to get too geeky on this particular video, if you want to know about malolactic fermentation, I would definitely get on the wine guide on the site. But mallow is a secondary fermentation that wines go through to soften them up. That's where a lot of that buttery quality come from. So is where the oak adds a little butter, but a lot more like vanilla and baking spices and things of that nature. Your malolactic fermentation gives you this creamy palate and this extra popcorn, buttered popcorn kind of flavor. Mayacamas does not do that. So what I picked today are 5 vintages, 2 bottles from a vintage that are 5 years apart. So I believe this is my 15. I want to start with a 15. Mayacamas 2015 Chardonnay from Mount Veeder. So Mayacamas high elevation winery there in the Mount Veeder AVA or sub-AVA of Napa Valley. So higher elevation, cooler temperatures, grapes can stay on the vine for longer. Now, 2015 though, it was a warmer year. It was it was another drought year, part of that drought that started in 2012 and proceeded all the way up to the wildfires. 2015 was one of those drought years that's in there with those warm temperatures, so a little bit more ripe fruit lower yields because of the not a lot of rain, but the lower yields equate to more concentrated fruit, especially with those warmer climates. Even in a higher elevation, Napa Valley, still a warmer climate relative to, say, someplace like Chablis. So a little bit riper vintage than the 2010. So on the nose with this 2015, Chardonnay usually takes on, it can take on a range of flavors, but a lot of times you've got citrus, you've got apples, you can even lead into things like peaches and tropical fruits. This Chardonnay has a good amount, it's got citrus, lemon, orange even. It's got a little rockiness to it, but not crazy, definitely not like a Chablis or something like that. But it does have tropical fruits, guys. It's going that kind of pear to peach to, I wouldn't put it to pineapple yet, but kind of like, almost like kiwi or lychee fruit. And definitely the citrus is more towards the sweeter citrus and not so much that really tart citrus. So not so much lemon to me, but more kind of towards lime and orange. Kumquat even. Let's take a sip. Wow, I had something right there on my tongue, but it went away. So, to start, incredibly well balanced. For a wine that did not go through malolactic fermentation, it's so creamy on the palate. It's not a really sharp acidity. I would say it's medium body, not that full body thing that Chardonnay can do. I would say it's medium to medium plus body. The finish, really nice and long and lingering. But the acidity is incredibly well balanced in here with the body and the alcohol. I think the alcohol is like 14. And I love, my economist does like the fraction. So it's not 14.25%, it's 14.25%. So 14.25% alcohol, which, generally what you want to look for with Chardonnay is if you're trying to kind of figure out, okay, am I somebody who likes a lighter? Am I somebody who likes a bigger bodied Chardonnay? Look at that alcohol content, because generally anything kind of 14% or lower will be on the lighter end. Anything above 14%, even though these are above 14%, they're just a little bit above 14%. Kind of a general rule you can follow is if it's above 14% alcohol, it's going to have a bigger body. It's going to have a fuller palate. It's going to linger longer, and it'll do the job quicker. That's for sure. Even though this is 14.25%, I would say this is about a medium to medium plus bodied wine. A lot of good, rich tropical fruits, but not cloying, not sweet in any way. There's good acidity here that's balancing out any sort of ripe fruit character that you're getting, which makes this for an overall incredibly well balanced wine. So this is just a really nice drinking wine by itself. No real food pairing is like jumping out at me just off the bat. I really would just like to just sit and enjoy this bottle of wine on its own. But I would say if you were to pair this with food, I would go something kind of basic with it, something like a chicken or a fatty or fish. I wouldn't say that it's a wine that can pair with anything really bold, but at the same time, I don't really see this as like a shellfish or like an oysters pairing wine. It takes towards that tropical fruit thing a little bit more, and not so much the mineral driven thing that you can see with some other Chardonnays. So my Icomus 2015, Mayacamas 2015. Generally, Mayacamas Chardonnays release somewhere between $40 and $50 a bottle. So even though they are an incredibly well-known producer and an incredibly focused and a very, very talented producers of Chardonnay and Cabernet and Napa Valley, their Chardonnays do not reach astronomical levels, and I think that as a good New World substitute for something like a Burgundy at an affordable price point, 40 to 50 bucks, I think that Mayacamas definitely plays that role well. With the 2010, so I mean, I'll give you guys a shot at the label here. Not a lot of difference here, just the 2010 vintage difference with the Mayacamas Chardonnay. What I wanted to point out was you probably saw there was a little bit missing from these bottles whenever I first started pouring them. The reason for that was both of these bottles were actually in a wine storage facility that I had stored a bunch of wine in, and the compressor on the cooling unit went out and it sat at about 90+ degrees for an entire weekend. So a lot of the wine in there was presumed ruined. I have since consumed the majority of that wine and have only had 1 or 2 bottles that have really tasted bad. So I wanted to pop the corks on these and make sure that they hadn't been ruined by that kind of heat issue there, and wanted to make sure that if I was actually tasting them on video that they tasted like they should, and they did. So that was good. 2010. So 2010 was a little bit of a not really an incredible vintage in Napa Valley, but it was a vintage that was some Chardonnays got some pretty good scores in 2010. And the reason for that is it was a cooler year. It was right before this 2011, which was a very damp, cool, wet kind of a year where you had a lot of fungal growth and things like that. 2010 was cooler, but it didn't have all that real wet, kind of rainy things going on with it. So what ended up happening is you had a little bit longer hang time on some of the fruit, which allowed it to develop a little bit better. So the 2010 version here, that was the other thing I wanted to show, is kind of the age worthiness of Chardonnay. This 2010 is, what we're coming up on. It's about a 10-year-old bottle of Chardonnay, which, white wines you generally look at drinking somewhere around a 5-year age range. But 2010, Chardonnays are definitely an age-worthy wine varietal, and is something that especially if you're producing them right, like they do at Mayacamas, you're going to get age-worthy expressions for sure. This one has a lot more of that minerality, that flinty smokiness on the nose for sure. Sorry guys, had to help the winemaker here bring in some inventory, so had to take a quick pause there. But yeah, 2010 Mayacamas Chardonnay. So talking a little bit about age worthiness with Chardonnay, especially from some place like Mayacamas. I mean, I think these guys' Chardonnays will go 15, 20 years easily. This one has a lot more minerality on the nose. You can definitely pick up some more of that kind of flintiness. And I don't necessarily think that has anything to do with any difference in winemaking or anything like that. Where that comes from is the vintage variation. So because Mayacamas has had this program in place for over 100, I think they're coming on 150 years, maybe 130 years that they've been making wine. They've really kind of kept the same programs in place. So what you have is just vintage variation. So because it was a cooler year, you didn't have the fruit concentrate so much to where you got those kind of bigger kind of bolder, riper fruit flavors and aromas coming through. So because the fruit's a little bit more restrained, you can pick up a little bit more of that minerality that comes from the soils that the vines are grown in there. So yeah, a little bit more minerality, and the fruit is a little bit less ripe, so now we're more towards that lemon lime as opposed to that kind of lime orange thing. And yeah, it's mostly a little bit of citrus and some minerality. Let's check out the palate. not as full. I would say if the 2015 was like medium plus body, this one's like medium bodied, but the acidity is about the exact same. So that kind of goes to show you the age worthiness of these Mayacamas Chardonnays, in that you've got a wine that's 5 years older than this wine, and it's still retaining this really fresh, bright, vibrant acidity. So this one is leaning more towards that shellfish pairing here. I would for sure put this in Shellfish City, man. Like oysters, shrimp. I wouldn't go full bodied enough to say like barbecue, like shrimp and grits. But if you're doing some like maybe some like peel and eat shrimp, or like a shrimp boil, something like that, definitely raw oysters. I don't know why, but I'm thinking about a fried shrimp po' boy right now. Sounds pretty damn good. Man, it might even be a higher acidity than the 2015. It could possibly be just because of that, it doesn't have that big ripe fruit to kind of cream out the palate a little bit. Still kind of nice and creamy though, even though, again, these wines don't go through malolactic fermentation, which is usually where you get that real creamy, unctuous mouthfeel. These are still incredibly smooth on the palate for Chardonnay that hasn't gone through malolactic fermentation. Zero butter, zero, I mean, the 15 maybe had a little bit of a hint of vanilla, but again, that's not really coming so much from the oak. I mean, I think they used like maybe 5% new oak on the 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe a little vanilla coming in from there. On this one, no vanilla, no butter on either of them, which right now is really kind of my style of Chardonnay. So, point of the video, guys, Chardonnay is a very versatile grape. I don't want to hear a lot of you out there saying, nah, I don't like to drink Chardonnay. It's too buttery for me. It's too rich for me. It's too, it's too big of a white wine for me. Because that's not always the case with Chardonnay. It's a chameleon grape. It takes on the form of its terroir. It takes on the essence of its winemaker, whether they decide to go big with it or whether they decide to keep it a little bit more restrained. So don't count Chardonnay out, guys. Those of you out there who are only drinking Sauvignon Blanc and things like that, go to your wine store, go to your, I mean, the guys at Specs and Total Wine are pretty good. But if you have like a local kind of smaller boutique wine store, I guarantee you those guys are going to have a hearty collection of Chardonnays, both from the new world and the old world. Tell them what you're into. Say, hey, I'm normally a Chardonnay, or I'm normally a Sauvignon Blanc drinker, or a Pinot Grigio drinker. My boy Mitch told me that I need to go check out some different styles of Chardonnay. What do you have that might match that? I guarantee you they can put you onto something that's in that lighter, crisper style that will bring you a little bit of a different flavor profile than your Sauvignon Blancs and your Pinot Grigios. So, with that being said, I believe I want to cut her off there. So, appreciate you guys being here with me on the Liquid Culture. Mitchell Chirac. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.